Hello students, welcome to today's session. So in this session, we will explore one of the most fascinating aspect of the neuroscience, that is neuroplasticity at the cellular and molecular level, and particularly how it supports the different form of learning. So let's start the session. So let's begin with by looking at the elementary form of learning. So broadly, learning can be divided into two major categories. One is non-associative learning, the other one is associative learning. So the non-associative learning is the simplest form of learning. It occurs when an individual is exposed to a single type of stimulus repeatedly and their response changes over time. So broadly, if we see, there are two classic examples like habituation and sensitization. So in habituation, where the response decreases the repeated exposure. So for instance, if you move to a house near a railway line, so in the beginning, the sound of the train feels very disturbing, but over the time, you stop noticing it because your brain has now in habituated to this particular stimulus. So the sensitization, it is just the opposite process where repeated exposure increase the response. So let's say just imagine touching a hot plate, let's say accidentally. So even a light touch after that makes you more sensitive and cautious. So your nervous system has amplified the response to protect you. So if we see on the other hand, we have associative learning, which is slightly more complex. So here the brain makes connections between two or more events. The first type is classical conditioning, where the natural stimuli is paired with a biological significant one. So the best known example is that uh, Pao's dog example, where a bell initially meaningless when paired with the food eventually triggered the salvation by itself for the dog. The second type of associative learning can be operant condition. So, which was actually introduced by a scientist, that is B.F. Skinner. So here, in by the scientist, the behavior of the rats has been observed. So uh, basically, the behavior is shaped by the consequences, that is, the rewards or the punishments. So, for example, if a child studies and is rewarded with praise or chocolates or sweets, they may like there is a chance that they are more likely to repeat that behavior. On the other hand, if touching a candle leads to a pain, the child itself learn to avoid it. So if we say like in nutshell, we can say that the habituation and the sensitization are non-associative forms of learning where classical and operant conditioning are associative form of learning. So the simple but maybe very powerful mechanism that underline how the uh, individual can start learning and the learning can be make more effective. So now let's start with the simplest form of learning, that is non-associative learning, where there are two main types, habituation and the sensitization, that we have just gone through. So now we know what is the habituation, where there is a gradual uh, reduction in the behavioral response to a stimuli that is repeated. So in the last example that we have taken, the train example, so there the stimuli is the train noise. So now an interesting property of habituation is that the response is not permanently lost. So if you take a break for a while and then hear the train sound again or face the stimulus again, so you might initially react as you facing that stimulus first time, and this is called the spontaneous recovery. So there's also something called dehabitation. So if a completely new stimulus appears, say a sudden thunderclap or maybe a loud horn, so you might suddenly react to that particular train sound. So even though it had some background noises, so basically this dehabitation helps to distinguish true habitation from simple fatigue, where you stop responding just because you are tired. On the other hand, sensitization is the opposite. Instead of your response decreases over time, so it actually increases. So for example, the same, if you touch a hot stove lightly by mistake, so next time even a gentle touch might make you pull up your hand back faster or more strongly than before, and that's the sensitization. So the enhancement of the behavioral response basically. So it can help if a stimulus is repeated with moderate to strong intensity, or if a weak stimulus is preceded by a strong or very high stimulus. So there is a phenomena sometimes called as pseudo conditioning. So now let's move on to the associative form of learning, so which involves connecting a stimulus and a response. So there are two main types, classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So in classical conditioning, a type of learning where no active action is required from the subject initially. There is no reward, no punishment involved in the basic sense, and no voluntary behavior needs to be performed. So the classic example that we usually take for this particular type of learning is that Powers experiment with dogs. So the dog naturally salivated when they saw food. So what the scientists did, they paired the food with the sound of a bell. And over time, just hearing the sound of the bell, even without the food, that caused the dogs to salivate. So that means the dog is showing the urge of food even without showing the food, just because of the uh, sound of the bell. So classical conditioning is about forming an association between two stimuli, and the response happens automatically without the subject performing an instrumental action or any voluntary action. Whereas on the other hand, the operant conditioning involves active behavior and consequences. So this type of learning is based on the Thorndike's law of effect. So which states that behavior followed by pleasant consequences are more likely to be repeated, while behavior followed by an unpleasant consequences are less likely to occur. So in operant conditioning, the experimenter arranges the outcomes. So a positive stimuli can be there or a negative stimuli can be there. So for example, a positive stimuli can be giving the food, and it increases the likelihood that the behavior will happen again. This is called the reinforcement. And in case of negative stimulus, such as a mild electric shock, decrease the likelihood that the behavior will be repeated. And this is called the punishment. So let's say if we take the example of rat in the Skinner box. So if the uh, rat presses a lever, he get the food. So it will press the lever more often. If pressing the lever delivers a shock, the rat will avoid to press the lever in future. So operant conditioning is all about learning through the consequences of voluntary actions. Now that we have discussed the basic forms of learning, let's look at the cellular and molecular mechanism that makes the learning possible. So these mechanisms actually allow the brain to adapt the change in response to experience and stimuli. So basically we can divide this learning as associative and non-associative learning. So in associative learning, that involves the forming connections between two or more stimuli uh, for the response or action. The most common example, as we know, is classical and operant conditioning. So at the cellular level, associative learning relies on changes in synaptic strength between the neurons. So there are two key mechanisms that actually takes place. The first is long-term potentiation, that is LTP, and the second one is long-term depression, that is LTD. So the long-term potentiation, the LTP, so this is where repeated activation of a synapses is telling it. So that means if we are giving the same stimuli again and again, the activation of the synapses get more stronger. So it involves the activation of NMDA receptor, which then triggers the insertion of AMPA receptor into the postsynaptic membrane. And this actually enhances excitatory transmission, making the neuron more responsive. On the other hand, the long-term depression, that is LTD, so this is the opposite process of LTP, where synapses are going to be weakened. So the LTD, the depression, occurs when activity at a synapses is reduced or inhibited, and that actually leading to a decrease in synaptic strength. So, for example, in dog experiment example, the scientist or the researcher paired the natural stimuli like bell with the biologically significant stimulus such as food. Over the time, the bell alone caused the dogs to salivate. So, at a natural level, repeated pairing strengthens the connections between the neurons responding to the bell and those controlling the salivation. So this is the example of LTP in action. In, for example, non-associative learning, uh, it involves changes in the behavior in response to a single stimulus without forming any association. So the two main forms are habituation and sensitization. So habituation is a decrease in response to a repeated irrelevant stimulus. For instance, if you hear a ticking clock sound in your room, you may notice it first, but over the time your response vanish. And at cellular level, the habituation is associated with the reduced neurotransmitter release or decreased sensitivity of postsynaptic receptor. And sensitization is actually opposite, an increase in response following a strong or uh, noxious stimulus. So a classic example comes from the Aplysia sea snail. So which when these snail receives a mild electric shock, they have a withdrawal reflexes. And as soon as we give electric shock, these withdrawal reflexes becomes more stronger and last longer. And this happens because serotonin is released, which enhance actually the signaling between the sensory and the motor neuron, making the reflex more prominent. So, in summary, if we say that both associative and non-associative learning depends on the cellular and molecular changes in the synapses, and by increasing the strength or weakening the neural connections, the brain is able to adapt, remember, and modify behavior based on experiences. And these mechanisms are fundamental of all sort of learning, from simple habituation to complex conditioning. So I hope now we have the more idea about the cellular and molecular mechanism that involve in associative and non-associative learning, and also its importance in neurorehabilitation. So thank you for joining this session.